My name is Cleo Bell. I'm 32 years old. 2 weeks ago, I drove 7 hours straight from a military base in North Carolina to a country club in Delaware for my younger sister Haley's wedding. I wore a tailored navy blazer and carried a crystal vase from her registry. My mother met me at the heavy oak doors of the venue. She did not hug me. She handed me a folded slip of paper with a Zoom link and said, "Family members only, watch it on the live stream." I said, "Got it." I turned around and drove home. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was shaking, demanding to know why my debit card had declined for the $23,000 venue bill. I laughed and told her exactly why. Welcome back to Look Vengeance. This is the place where real family betrayal meets cold, hard facts. If you have ever been treated like a guest in your own family, you are going to want to hear every detail of this one. Drop a comment below and tell me your age and where you are listening from. And make sure you hit subscribe, because the financial trap my parents stepped into, they built it themselves. I should probably tell you who I am before I tell you what they did. I work as a logistics and financial auditor for the Department of Defense. I am stationed out of Dover Air Force Base. My job is to track missing resources in military supply chains. I deal with numbers, cold facts, and zero-sum outcomes. I look for discrepancies. A missing pallet of medical supplies leaves a paper trail. A diverted fund leaves a digital footprint. People lie, but routing numbers tell the truth. I live a quiet life. I wake up at 5 in the morning. I drink black coffee. I run 4 miles before the sun comes up. I am not a person who thrives on drama. I showed up to Haley's wedding because that is the baseline requirement of being a sibling. The Wilmington Country Club smelled of imported white orchids and roasted garlic. The bass from the 8-piece cover band vibrated through the brass handles of the double doors. I stood on the patterned rug in the foyer, shifting my weight off my right heel. 7 hours of highway driving will stiffen your joints. I held the crystal vase in a silver gift bag. The heavy doors opened just wide enough for a person to slip through. My mother, Susan, stepped into the foyer. She pulled the door shut behind her, cutting off the music. She wore a champagne-colored gown that caught the light from the chandelier overhead. She did not smile. She held up her hand, palm out, like a traffic cop halting a line of cars. "Stop right there, Cleo." Her voice was hushed, urgent. She glanced over her shoulder at the closed doors, making sure nobody had followed her out. She reached into her clutch purse, pulled out a small printed slip of paper, and pressed it into my hand. I looked down. It was a URL string. "Family, only inside," my mother whispered. Haley wants a specific aesthetic for the photographer. The layout is tight. You can watch the ceremony from the overflow lounge near the Golf Pro Shop. There is a television set up. I looked from the paper to her face. Then I looked at her wrist. Wrapped around her forearm, sitting just below a diamond tennis bracelet, was a silver foil wristband. The letters VIP were printed across it in stark black ink. Through the frosted glass of the doors behind her, I could see 2 of Haley's friends holding champagne flutes. They wore the exact same silver bands. My mother had color-coded her affection. A normal reaction might involve tears. Someone else might have raised their voice, demanded an explanation, or caused a scene in the lobby. I evaluate deficits. I tapped the face of my Apple Watch with my index finger to wake the screen. My resting heart rate flashed neon green, 65 beats per minute. Ice water. "Got it," I said. I did not wait for her to explain the aesthetic further. I handed her the silver gift bag containing the crystal vase. I turned on my heel, pushed through the glass revolving doors, and walked out into the humid July evening. I got into my sedan, put the car in drive, and headed home. I accepted the rejection. I did not shed a single tear on the drive back to Maryland. The silence lasted exactly 48 hours. On Tuesday morning at 9:14, I was sitting at my kitchen island reviewing a supply manifest. My phone vibrated across the granite counter. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I swiped the green icon and put it on speaker. Cleo, Susan gasped. The champagne gown composure was stripped away. She sounded breathless, frantic. Why is the card declining? The venue manager is standing right in front of me. You need to fix this right now. The final $23,000 bill just bounced. I leaned back in my chair. I let the silence hang in the air for 5 seconds. I could hear her breathing heavily through the speaker. "Family pays for family, Mom," I said. My voice was flat, even the exact tone I use when informing a contractor their invoice has been rejected. I am just a guest on a live stream. "I do not have time for your games, Cleo." My mother's voice echoed off the granite island in my kitchen, tinny and distorted through the phone speaker. Behind her, I could hear the distinct sound of a pen tapping against a hard surface. The venue manager. He was standing right there, waiting for his money. "Unfreeze the card right now. He is threatening to hold the catering deposit. Haley will be devastated." I took a slow sip of my black coffee. The ceramic mug was warm against my palms. I looked out the kitchen window at the morning traffic rolling down the street. To understand the sheer audacity of her demand, you need to understand why my mother possessed a debit card linked to my name in the first place. You need to understand what happened 48 months ago. 4 years ago, I stood in a sterile triage room at Kent General Hospital. The air smelled of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and old floor wax. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, irritating vibration. My father, Richard, lay on a narrow hospital bed, wearing a faded paper gown. He was clutching his chest, his eyes squeezed shut in what looked like profound agony. A heart monitor beeped rhythmically beside him. My mother sat in a plastic chair in the corner, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I had left my duty station the moment she called, driving 3 hours over the speed limit, convinced I was about to lose my father. The attending physician walked in, checked the chart, and said the EKG was normal. He suggested acid reflux or stress. But Richard insisted the pain was radiating down his arm. He insisted his heart was failing. When the doctor left the room, Susan grabbed my forearm. Her acrylic nails dug into my skin through the fabric of my uniform. "The insurance will not cover the out-of-pocket costs for the specialists, Cleo," she whispered. Her eyes were red-rimmed, pleading. "He needs specialized medication. He needs a dedicated cardiologist. Haley is still in college. She cannot help. You have that government job. You have steady pay. If we do not get this medication, your father is going to die." I am an auditor. I analyze risk. I assess deficits. Looking at my father clutching his chest, I did not ask for a second opinion. I did not ask for a breakdown of the pharmacy copays. I did the math on my own, living expenses, cut my retirement contributions in half, and canceled a planned trip to Europe. Right there in the hospital waiting room, I opened a high-yield checking account. I set up an automated clearinghouse transfer. $800 drafted from my primary military salary account on the first of every single month, deposited directly into the new medical fund. I requested a secondary debit card and had it mailed to their address in Delaware. $800 a month, $9,600 a year, $38,400 over 4 years. That was the heart medication fund. That was the card my mother was currently trying to swipe at a country club for a $23,000 wedding venue bill. Let us go back to the country club parking lot 2 days ago. When my mother handed me that index card with the Zoom link, I did not just drive away. I walked to my sedan. I unlocked the door. I sat in the driver's seat. The engine was off. The cabin was sweltering in the July heat, but I did not turn on the air conditioning. I pulled my phone from my blazer pocket. Face ID unlocked the screen. I tapped the banking icon. I scrolled past my primary checking account. I scrolled past my savings. I tapped on the joint medical fund. The balance sat there in bold black numbers. I tapped the card management settings. A menu popped up with a toggle switch next to the image of the debit card. I pressed my thumb against the toggle. The switch slid from green to gray. A prompt appeared on the screen, asking to confirm the permanent freeze on all outgoing transactions. I pressed confirm. In less than 10 seconds, I severed the financial umbilical cord I had maintained for 4 years. I did not do it out of spite. I did it because the transaction parameters had changed. My mother made it clear I was not a participant in the family structure. I was a spectator on a screen. Spectators do not pay the production costs. Now back in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning, Susan's voice broke through my thoughts, pulling me back to the present. "Cleo, are you listening to me?" Her voice was escalating the pitch, rising with every syllable. "The manager says the card is coming back as frozen by the primary account holder. You have to call your bank and authorize the charge. The account is permanently closed." "Mom," I said, "what are you talking about?" She gasped. "You cannot do that. That is our money." "It is my money," I corrected her. My tone remained flat. It has always been my money. I set up that account for Dad's heart medication. A country club ballroom is not a pharmacy. A catering bill is not a copay. You are being incredibly selfish. She was practically spitting the words into the receiver. "Haley's honeymoon flight leaves in 4 hours. Do you want to ruin her wedding week because you are throwing a tantrum over a photograph layout?" "I am not throwing a tantrum. I am enforcing a boundary. You handed me a live stream link. You told me I was not family. I am simply adjusting my financial contributions to match my new status." There was a brief pause on the line. I could hear the venue manager whispering something in the background. Then the panic in my mother's voice vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp edge. It was the sound of a cornered animal deciding to bite. "You think you are so smart, Cleo," she hissed. "You think you can just walk away from this, but you cannot. You are legally responsible." I took another sip of coffee. Legally responsible for what exactly? "For the venue." She sounded triumphant, now weaponizing the situation. "You signed the financial guarantee contract. Your name is on the primary billing ledger. If this card does not clear today, Mr. Sterling is going to hand the file straight to his corporate lawyers. They are going to sue you for the full $23,000 plus damages." I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I lowered my coffee mug to the granite counter. I did not make a sound. "You signed the contract." Those were her exact words. My mind shifted gears. The hurt daughter disappeared entirely. The Department of Defense logistics auditor took the wheel. I looked at the supply manifest on my kitchen island. I looked at the numbers, the signatures, the chain of custody required for a single crate of engine parts to move from a warehouse to a flight line. Systems have rules. Financial institutions have strict protocols. A high-end wedding venue in the state of Delaware does not process a $23,000 guarantee on a third-party debit card without a paper trail. They require a physical signature. They require a matching, unexpired, government-issued identification card. The card Susan was holding was flagged in the banking system for pharmacy and medical expenses, a strict categorization code I had set up 4 years ago to monitor the funds. I had never stepped foot inside Mr. Sterling's office. I had never seen a catering contract. I had never provided my driver license to the Wilmington Country Club. So how did a venue accept a medical debit card as a primary guarantor without my physical signature? "Mom," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet, "tell Mr. Sterling I need to see the contract." I disconnected the call before my mother could say another word. The silence in my kitchen was absolute. The morning traffic outside my window seemed to move in slow motion. I did not panic. Panic is a useless emotion. It clouds judgment and slows reaction time. In my line of work, when a multi-million-dollar shipment of aviation fuel goes missing, you do not panic. You start pulling the invoices. You trace the paper. I opened my laptop, clicked open a browser window, and searched for the Wilmington Country Club directory. I found the general manager's contact information. Mr. Arthur Sterling. I picked up my phone and dialed the country club's main office line. The receptionist answered on the second ring. I bypassed the pleasantries. "This is Cleo Bell," I said. My voice was a flat line of authority. "I need to be transferred to Mr. Sterling immediately. It concerns the billing ledger for the Haley Bell wedding that took place this past weekend." There was a brief hold, the sound of elevator jazz piping through the receiver, before a deep, polished voice came on the line. "Miss Bell, Arthur Sterling speaking. I am assuming you are calling to resolve the outstanding balance. Your mother has been quite distressed in my office for the last 20 minutes. The catering staff needs to be paid. The floral vendors are demanding their cut." "Mr. Sterling?" I replied, staring blankly at the granite countertop. "I am calling to request a copy of the primary billing contract, the document that lists me as the financial guarantor. I need it emailed to my secure address within the next 5 minutes." I could hear the slight hesitation on his end, the defensive posture of a businessman who senses a trap. "We sent the finalized contract to your email address 3 months ago, Miss Bell. You signed it. We have the completed file on record." "Send it again," I countered. "I need the original PDF with all attached addendums and the signature page." He agreed, likely assuming this was a final administrative hurdle before I authorized the payment. I gave him a secondary email address, one not connected to any of my personal devices, a habit ingrained from years of handling classified supply chain data. 2 minutes later, a notification pinged on my laptop, an email from the Wilmington Country Club billing department. Attached was a single PDF file titled Bell Wedding Financial Guarantee. I clicked download. I opened the file. My eyes scanned the first page. It outlined the venue rental fee, the per-plate catering costs, the open bar tab, and the mandatory 20% gratuity. It detailed a total estimated cost of $23,450. I scrolled to the second page, the payment authorization form. There, printed clearly in the primary account holder box, was my full legal name. Below that, my Social Security number listed in its entirety. Below that, my date of birth. My blood ran cold. A heavy, suffocating weight settled in the center of my chest. This was not a physical document signed with a ballpoint pen in an office. This was an electronic agreement, a DocuSign file. I stared at my Social Security number. The digits glared back at me from the bright screen. To execute an electronic contract of this magnitude, the system requires identity verification. It requires Personal Identifiable Information, PII. It is the digital equivalent of a fingerprint. My mind flashed back to last Thanksgiving. I had visited my parents' house in Delaware for a mandatory holiday dinner. I had brought a folder of tax documents to sort through on their dining room table, including an old W-2 form from my first year at the Department of Defense. I remembered leaving the folder on the table while I went to help my mother in the kitchen. I remembered coming back to find the folder slightly misaligned, the papers shuffled. I had dismissed it at the time. I had assumed someone had just bumped the table. I was wrong. Susan had not just swiped a debit card. She had systematically harvested my private financial data. She had transcribed my Social Security number. She had weaponized my identity to bypass the venue's security protocols. I scrolled to the final page of the PDF, the signature block. There was a digital signature stamp, a cursive font mimicking a handwritten name, Cleo Marie Bell. Below the signature was a time and date stamp, executed on April 14th at 2:14 p.m. The family drama had just crossed a devastating threshold. We were no longer dealing with toxic behavior, emotional manipulation, or favoritism. We were no longer arguing over wristbands or Zoom links. This was a crime. Under the United States Code, Title 18, Section 1028, the unauthorized use of another person's identifying information to obtain a thing of value is felony identity theft. The transmission of that forged contract across state lines via email constituted felony wire fraud. My mother had committed 2 federal offenses to pay for a country club wedding. She had legally bound me to a massive debt, assuming my sense of familial duty would force me to quietly absorb the cost. She assumed the strong sister would just fix the problem, like she always did. She assumed I would not look at the metadata. I am an auditor. I do not just look at the signature. I look at the foundation the signature is built on. A DocuSign PDF is not a static image. It is a container of information. Embedded within the file code is a digital audit trail. It tracks exactly when the document was opened, how long it was viewed, and most importantly, the exact location of the device that executed the signature. I moved my cursor to the top toolbar of the PDF reader. I clicked on the Document Properties tab. A window opened displaying the metadata. I navigated to the Security section and extracted the signature details. The system provided a certificate of completion. It listed the email address that received the document, a fake Gmail account created using my name but ending in a string of random numbers. It listed the browser used to open it, and it listed the IP address of the device that finalized the forgery. I highlighted the string of numbers. I copied the IP address. I opened a new browser tab and pasted the numbers into a geolocation tracking tool, a tool I frequently use to trace unverified vendor logins attempting to access military procurement portals. I hit enter. The tracking tool processed the data. A map appeared on the screen, dropping a red pin on a specific coordinate. It displayed the internet service provider and the registered geographic location. I stared at the map. The red pin was not located in my parents' quiet suburban neighborhood in Delaware. The IP address traced directly to a luxury apartment complex in downtown Philadelphia. An apartment complex I knew well. An apartment complex I had helped move furniture into 3 years ago. The IP address belonged to Haley. The red pin on the digital map anchored itself to a specific set of coordinates in Center City, Philadelphia. I stared at the high-resolution satellite image displayed on my monitor. The geolocation tool had bypassed the general service provider hub and pinpointed the exact building. It was a 12-story luxury high-rise constructed of glass and steel. I knew that building. I knew the lobby attendant. I knew the freight elevator code. 3 years ago, I spent an entire holiday weekend hauling cardboard boxes and assembled furniture into Unit 1204. I helped paint the living room walls a neutral shade of eggshell. I stood on a step stool to install the curtain rods. Unit 1204 belonged to Haley and her new husband, Trevor. The digital footprint did not lie. The electronic agreement holding me responsible for a $23,000 catering bill was not executed from my parents' suburban home in Delaware. It was signed, sealed, and delivered from a laptop connected to the wireless network inside my sister's apartment. Before my mind could fully process the gravity of that location, the cell phone resting on my kitchen counter began to vibrate. It moved across the polished granite in short, rapid bursts. The screen illuminated the dim kitchen. I looked down. The caller ID displayed Haley's name. I did not pick it up. The phone stopped vibrating, paused for a fraction of a second, and then a cascade of text messages began pouring onto the lock screen. I leaned forward and read the notifications as they appeared. Message 1. Mom just called me crying. What is wrong with you? Message 2. You are ruining my honeymoon. Trevor and I cannot even enjoy the beach because the catering manager keeps calling his phone. Message 3. You have the money. Stop punishing me because you are single and bitter. Message 4. Mom said you agreed to cover the venue fee since you refused to buy my custom dress. You promised her. Call the bank and fix it right now. I read the final text a second time. My eyes traced the letters. The comment about the custom dress was the missing puzzle piece. It provided the exact motive for the crime. 8 months prior, Haley had invited me to a bridal boutique in Georgetown. It was a high-end salon with velvet seating and complimentary champagne. She stepped out of the dressing room wearing a silk tulle gown with intricate French lace detailing along the bodice. She stood on the pedestal, looked at herself in the three-way mirror, and announced it was the one. Then she turned to me and handed me the price tag, $4,000. She assumed I would pay for it. She assumed my military salary was a communal family asset. I handed the tag back to the consultant, looked my sister in the eye, and told her I was not funding a designer gown. I told her to look at the clearance rack. Haley threw a textbook tantrum. She stormed out of the boutique. Susan followed her to the parking lot, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. I stood near the entrance and watched my mother whisper into Haley's ear. "We will make it work," Susan had said. "I promise you, sweetie. We will find a way. The definition of finding a way was identity theft. The text messages sitting on my phone screen shifted the entire landscape of this betrayal. Up until this moment, I had operated under the assumption that Susan was a desperate mother acting alone. I assumed she had panicked, stolen my tax documents, and forged the signature to protect Haley from the financial reality of her own wedding. I assumed Haley was just a spoiled, ignorant beneficiary. The IP address and the text messages painted a different picture. Haley was not shielded from the truth. She was the project manager. My sister and her husband had sat on their velvet sofa in Philadelphia. They had logged into a wireless network I helped them set up. They had created a dummy email account, typed my social security number into a blank field, and clicked confirm. They orchestrated the fraud together. I picked up my phone. The cursor blinked in the reply box. I could have typed a dozen different responses. I could have asked her how the weather was in the Bahamas. I could have attached a screenshot of the geolocation map. I could have told her to enjoy the beach because she was going to need the tan for her mugshot. I locked the screen. I set the phone face down on the counter. An auditor does not argue with the subject of an investigation. An auditor builds an airtight file. I turned my attention back to my laptop. I closed the geolocation tab. I opened a fresh Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, a clean, blank grid. I clicked on cell A1. I typed the word date. In cell B1, I typed IP address. In cell C1, I typed fraudulent action. In cell D1, I typed legal statute. The spreadsheet was a mechanism for control. It was a way to convert the sharp, stinging pain of familial betrayal into organized data. I logged the date of the signature. I pasted the Philadelphia IP address. I recorded the fake email account. I downloaded the text messages from my phone and attached them as exhibits to a primary folder on my encrypted hard drive. I worked in silence for 45 minutes. The only sound in the kitchen was the rhythmic clicking of my keyboard. When you cut off the oxygen to a fire, it tries to find another source of air. When you refuse to engage with manipulative people, their initial reaction is panic. They realize their primary tactic is failing. They realize the target is no longer responding to emotional provocation. My silence was a brick wall. Susan and Haley could not break through it. They could not force me to scream cry or authorize a $23,000 bank transfer. So they executed their backup plan. If they could not control me, they would control the narrative surrounding me. They would burn my reputation to the ground to distract from their own impending ruin. My phone chimed. It was a different ringtone this time. Not Haley, not my mother. I flipped the device over. The notification displayed a text message from my Aunt Patricia. Patricia was my father's older sister. She lived in a neighboring town and served as the unofficial matriarch of the extended family network. She hosted the holiday parties. She organized the summer barbecues. She held significant influence over aunts, uncles, and cousins across 3 state lines. I tapped the message preview to open the full text. Cleo, I am disgusted by your behavior. Your mother just called me in tears. Showing up to your sister's wedding intoxicated, causing a scene in the lobby, and then canceling the catering check out of pure spite because you are single and jealous is beyond unacceptable. You need to apologize to your family immediately and pay the bill you promised to cover. Do not contact me until you make this right. I stared at the screen. Intoxicated, causing a scene, jealous. Susan had mobilized the family militia. She had planted a false flag to ensure every relative viewed me as the villain. She was isolating me, assuming public humiliation would force me into compliance. I did not type a response to Patricia. I did not defend myself. I dragged my mouse across my desk and opened a new browser tab. I logged into my secure government clearance portal. It was time to run a soft financial background check on my own parents. The phone on my kitchen counter did not stop vibrating. The notifications arrived in a steady, rhythmic pulse. The screen lit up, went dark, and lit up again. My mother had activated the family network. She was an expert at controlling the flow of information. She knew that if she struck first, she could frame the narrative before I even realized there was a war. Aunt Patricia was just the vanguard. Within 20 minutes, my phone received messages from 4 different time zones. Uncle Marcus sent a text calling me an embarrassment to the family name. He stated my father was heartbroken by my erratic behavior. Cousin Lauren sent a long, condescending paragraph suggesting I seek professional counseling for my unresolved jealousy issues. She said ruining a wedding because I could not find a date was a sign of deep psychological trauma. The storyline was identical across every single message. Susan had distributed a unified script. The script dictated that I arrived at the Wilmington Country Club heavily intoxicated. I confronted the venue staff. I screamed at my younger sister in the lobby. I canceled the catering payment out of pure spite to destroy her special day. I was the bitter single older sister lashing out at the beautiful young bride. Aunt Patricia was the primary distributor of this fiction. In the ecosystem of our extended family, Patricia held the role of chief broadcaster. She organized the summer reunions and the holiday dinners. People listened to her. Susan knew that if she convinced Patricia of my guilt, the rest of the family would fall in line without asking a single question. Patricia was the red herring. She was the loud, aggressive distraction designed to draw my fire. Human nature dictates a predictable response to public humiliation. When a group of people accuses you of something horrific, the instinct is to fight back. The average person would pick up the phone, dial Patricia, and scream the truth into the receiver. The average person would post screenshots of the forged contract on social media to clear their name and demand an apology. I did not touch the phone. Engaging with a smear campaign validates the premise that there is an argument to be had. I was not interested in a shouting match with relatives who only spoke to me on Thanksgiving. Defending myself would only give them more ammunition. It would drag me into a chaotic, emotional arena where facts mattered less than volume. Public humiliation requires a participating victim. I refused to participate. I pushed the cell phone to the far edge of the granite island. I turned my focus back to the bright display of my laptop monitor. As a logistics auditor for the Defense Department, I possess a highly specific set of investigative skills. My daily routine involves tracking missing aviation fuel, auditing diverted contractor funds, and analyzing supply chain discrepancies. I know how to find buried assets. I know how to read the negative space in a financial ledger. When the numbers do not balance, the truth hides in the margins. I opened a secure browser window. I navigated to a public records database utilized by municipal tax assessors and financial investigators. This system aggregates property deeds, civil court filings, and municipal liens. I typed my parents' Delaware address into the search bar. The screen loaded a detailed property profile for the 4-bedroom colonial they purchased in 1996. I scrolled past the basic lot dimensions and the yearly property tax assessments. I moved directly to the deed and lien history. If Susan and Richard were desperate enough to commit identity theft for a $23,000 catering bill, their financial ecosystem was in critical failure. People with healthy savings accounts do not forge government documents to pay for floral arrangements. Desperation always leaves a paper trail. The property history displayed a standard 30-year fixed-rate mortgage initiated when they bought the house. It showed a routine refinance a decade later to secure a lower interest rate. Everything appeared stable and predictable for a middle-class suburban couple nearing retirement age. Then I spotted the anomaly. 14 months ago, a secondary lien was recorded against the property. My parents had taken out a second mortgage. They had extracted $165,000 in equity from the home they had spent decades paying off. I leaned closer to the monitor. I read the date of the transaction a second time to ensure I was not misinterpreting the timeline. The lien was filed 14 months prior to Haley standing in a bridal boutique looking at a $4,000 dress. It was filed 14 months prior to Susan logging into a dummy email account to execute a fraudulent DocuSign contract. They had secured a 6-figure cash injection just over a year ago. Yet they were currently operating like a family facing imminent bankruptcy. I ran a mental inventory of my parents' lifestyle over the past year. Richard still drove a 7-year-old domestic sedan with a dent in the rear bumper. Susan still drove the same silver crossover she purchased used 5 years ago. They had not remodeled the kitchen. The roof of the Colonial still sported the same weathered asphalt shingles I remembered from high school. They took no luxury vacations. They bought no secondary vacation property. There were no visible assets to account for a $165,000 withdrawal. A sum of that size does not simply evaporate. Money is physical energy. It transfers from one location to another. If the funds were not invested back into the property, and they were not sitting in a checking account to cover the wedding expenses, they had been diverted elsewhere. I sat back in my chair. The cold logic of the situation settled over me. My parents were entirely broke. They had drained their primary asset. They had stolen my identity to secure a line of credit. The entire facade of their comfortable suburban life was a hollow shell. They were drowning in invisible debt. But the central question remained unanswered. Where did the money go? If you want to find a major leak in a reservoir, you do not just stare at the empty basin. You follow the smaller streams connected to it. You look for patterns in the current. I knew of one specific stream of income that flowed directly into their household, a stream I had personally authorized and maintained. I opened a new tab on my browser. I navigated to my primary banking portal. I typed in my credentials and bypassed the two-factor authentication prompt on my phone. I clicked on the joint medical account, the account I had permanently frozen just 2 days ago in the country club parking lot, the account specifically designated for Richard and his phantom heart condition. For 4 years, I had treated that account like a fixed utility bill. I set the $800 monthly automated transfer and forgot about it. I never logged in to review the itemized transactions because I trusted the narrative. I trusted that the funds were covering specialized pharmacy copays, out-of-network cardiologist deductibles, and necessary medical equipment. Trust is a vulnerability. Verification is a shield. I navigated to the statement generation tool on the banking dashboard. I clicked the drop-down menu for the date range. I selected the custom option. I set the starting date to the exact day I opened the account 4 years ago, sitting in the sterile waiting room of Kent General Hospital. I set the end date to the current morning. I clicked the download button. The system processed the request. A small loading circle spun in the center of the screen. I waited in the quiet kitchen. I was about to pull back the curtain on 48 months of financial history. I was about to see exactly what my $38,400 had purchased. The loading circle on the banking portal spun for a few seconds before the file generated. A heavy PDF document dropped into my download folder. It contained 48 months of transaction history. Every single swipe, transfer, and deposit made since that afternoon in the hospital waiting room. I opened the document, the screen filled with lines of data categorized by date, vendor name, and dollar amount. I am accustomed to reviewing massive spreadsheets filled with contractor overruns and misplaced logistics funds. I look for discrepancies. I look for the anomaly that indicates fraud. I did not need to hunt for anomalies in this ledger. The entire document was a glaring, undeniable confession. I started at month 1. The very first $800 automated transfer landed in the account on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the balance was 0. I checked the vendor column. The funds were not routed to a local pharmacy. They were not sent to a cardiovascular specialist. The entire $800 was transferred via an automated clearinghouse transaction to a secondary checking account. I moved to month 2. The $800 deposited on the 1st of the month. On the 3rd of the month, a $450 debit card transaction was processed at a high-end day spa in downtown Wilmington. The remaining $350 was transferred to the same secondary checking account. I scrolled to month 3, month 4, year 1, year 2. The pattern was identical. The money hit the account and evaporated within 72 hours. I pulled out a notepad and a pen. I began itemizing the specific vendor names attached to the debit card transactions. The list grew rapidly. A luxury resort in the Florida Keys, a boutique hotel in Charleston, multiple charges at a designer handbag retailer in the King of Prussia Mall, recurring monthly payments to a boutique fitness studio, and then a new category emerged in the third year. Starting 18 months ago, the direct transfers shifted. Instead of funneling the money into a secondary checking account, large chunks of the deposits were routed to a digital currency exchange. These were not small transactions. $600 here, $700 there, thousands of dollars converted into cryptocurrency and sent into the digital ether. I set the pen down. I looked at the total figure sitting at the bottom of the fourth-year summary, $38,400. There was not a single medical copay listed in the entire 4-year history. There was no cardiologist. There was no specialized medication. There was no life-threatening arterial blockage requiring out-of-pocket cash. The heart condition was a phantom. My father had lay in a hospital bed clutching his chest while my mother sobbed in a plastic chair, putting on a performance designed to extract nearly $40,000 from my military salary. They had weaponized my empathy. They had calculated exactly how much pressure to apply to ensure I opened my wallet without asking questions. The illusion of parental care dissolved, leaving behind the stark reality of calculated financial abuse. They did not steal from me because they were desperate to save a life. They stole from me to fund a lifestyle. My long hours at Dover Air Base, the early morning runs, the delayed retirement contributions, all of it subsidized Haley's designer bags and unexplained crypto investments. The timeline of the fraud crystallized. The $38,400 was gone. It was burned through entirely before Haley even picked a wedding date. That explained the second mortgage. When my monthly deposits were no longer enough to cover the escalating luxury expenses and the crypto transfers, my parents tapped the equity in their home. When that $165,000 vanished, they hit a hard financial wall. They had no cash left to pay for the country club wedding. The DocuSign forgery was their final desperate play. They assumed the venue would process the $23,000 charge against the primary account linked to the forged contract. When that failed, they assumed they could simply pressure me into unfreezing the medical account, intending to use the incoming monthly deposits to slowly pay down the catering debt. When I froze the card in the parking lot, I severed their final lifeline. The entire financial house of cards collapsed in an instant. The betrayal was absolute. It was a cold, methodical extraction of resources executed by the people who were supposed to protect me. I did not feel sadness. I did not feel the urge to call them and demand an explanation. The facts were laid out in black and white on the PDF document. There was nothing left to discuss. The emotional bond between mother, father, and daughter was permanently severed, replaced by the sterile relationship between an auditor and a perpetrator. I closed the bank statement file. I saved it to my encrypted hard drive, dragging it into the master folder containing the DocuSign metadata and Haley's text messages. The file was growing. The evidence was stacking up. I stood up from the kitchen island. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. The smear campaign orchestrated by Aunt Patricia no longer mattered. The angry text messages from cousins no longer carried any weight. They were operating on a script written by a thief. I knew the truth. I spent the rest of the week compartmentalizing the situation. I went to work at the base. I reviewed logistics reports. I ran my 4 miles every morning. I ignored the continuous stream of notifications lighting up my phone. I treated my family like a closed case file. But a case file is never truly closed until the liability is resolved. On Friday afternoon, I was sitting at my desk in the logistics department at Dover Air Base. The office was quiet. Most of the personnel had already left for the weekend. I was finishing a quarterly supply manifest when the base mail clerk walked into the room. He held a thick, oversized manila envelope. It had a bright red sticker across the front. Certified mail. Signature required. The clerk placed the envelope on my desk and handed me a digital clipboard. I signed my name on the screen and handed it back. He nodded and left the office. I stared at the envelope. The return address printed in the top left corner belonged to a corporate law firm located in downtown Wilmington. The firm name was embossed in heavy black ink: Sterling and Associates, Legal Counsel. I picked up a letter opener and sliced through the top of the envelope. I slid a thick stack of high-quality legal paper onto my desk. The cover letter was printed on official firm letterhead. It was addressed directly to me using my full legal name and my military rank. I read the opening paragraph. Dear Ms. Bell, this firm represents the Wilmington Country Club and its general manager, Mr. Arthur Sterling. This letter serves as formal notice of intent to initiate civil litigation regarding the unpaid balance of $23,450 associated with the event hosted on July 14th. I skimmed down the page. Despite multiple attempts to resolve this matter with the event organizers, the financial obligation remains unsatisfied. As the primary guarantor listed on the executed catering contract, you are legally responsible for the immediate remittance of the total balance. Failure to submit payment within 5 business days will result in the filing of a civil lawsuit in the Delaware Superior Court. Attached to the threat was a printed copy of the forged DocuSign contract. My Social Security number and the fake digital signature stared back at me. My mother's desperate gamble had officially landed on my desk. The country club was not interested in family drama. They were not interested in who actually ate the prime rib. They possessed a contract with my name on it, and they were activating their legal department to extract the funds. The conflict had escalated from a domestic dispute into a formal legal threat. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the manila envelope. I did not panic. I did not reach for my checkbook. I reached for my phone. I held the heavy cardstock of the Sterling & Associates letterhead in my left hand. The paper was expensive, designed to convey authority and trigger immediate compliance. I ran my thumb over the raised black ink of the firm logo. Law firms that specialize in debt collection rely on a very specific psychological response. They expect the recipient to open the envelope, read the formal legal jargon, and experience a sudden rush of dread. They expect you to visualize courtrooms, judge gavels, and ruined credit scores. They expect you to surrender. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct extension listed beneath the signature block of a Mr. Gregory Pierce, Senior Counsel. The line rang twice before a receptionist transferred me. A moment later, a man answered. His tone was brisk and practiced, the voice of someone who spends his days intimidating people over unpaid invoices. Gregory Pierce speaking, he said. Mr. Pierce, I replied. My name is Cleo Bell. I am calling regarding the certified demand letter your office delivered to my duty station 20 minutes ago. There was a shifting sound on the other end of the line, the rustle of paper or the click of a mouse as he pulled up my file. Ah, Ms. Bell, I assume you are calling to arrange a payment schedule for the outstanding country club balance. We require a minimum transfer of $10,000 today to halt the civil filing process. I leaned back in my desk chair. I looked at the logistics report stacked neatly on my workspace. I am not calling to arrange a payment, Mr. Pierce. I am calling to inform your firm that the contract you referenced in your demand letter is a fraudulent instrument. I will not be remitting a single cent to your client. The lawyer let out a short, dismissive sigh. It was a calculated sound meant to make me feel small. Ms. Bell, we hear this excuse every day. Buyer remorse does not invalidate a signed financial guarantee. We possess a finalized electronic agreement bearing your name, your Social Security number, and your signature. If you refuse to pay, we will secure a judgment against you in court and garnish your military wages. He was leaning on the standard playbook: fear, urgency, repercussion. I let his threat hang in the air for 3 full seconds. Silence is a highly effective tool in negotiations. It forces the other party to listen to the echo of their own words. Mr. Pierce, I said, keeping my voice level and precise, I am a logistics and financial auditor for the Department of Defense. I spend 50 hours a week analyzing multi-million-dollar supply chain discrepancies. I know how to read a contract, and more importantly, I know how to read the metadata embedded inside one. The line went entirely still. The dismissive sigh did not return. You do not possess my signature, I continued. You possess a DocuSign electronic stamp. That stamp was generated using my stolen, personal, identifiable information. I have already extracted the digital certificate from the PDF your client provided. The IP address associated with the execution of that document traces to a residential high-rise in downtown Philadelphia. I am currently sitting at my desk at Dover Air Base in Delaware. I can provide gate logs, swipe card data, and sworn statements from my commanding officers proving I was on federal property at the exact minute that contract was digitally signed. I paused, allowing the geographical disparity to sink into his legal mind. If you file a civil suit based on a forged document transmitted across state lines, I said, you and your client become active participants in felony wire fraud. I will not just defend myself in civil court. I will hand my forensic audit directly to the federal authorities. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched out. It was the distinct sound of a corporate attorney realizing he had walked into a trap. He had expected a crying, overwhelmed sister. He got an auditor armed with federal statutes. Ms. Bell, he started, his voice losing its sharp edge. The tone was cautious, now defensive. The venue requires a guarantor. The event took place. Services were rendered. That is an issue between Mr. Sterling and the individuals who actually consumed his prime rib, I replied. But before I finalize my police report, I need one more piece of data from your office. What data? He asked. A venue like the Wilmington Country Club does not reserve a prime Saturday in July based solely on a signature, I explained. They require a holding deposit, usually 20% of the estimated cost. Someone had to put down real cash months ago to lock in the date. I need the expanded DocuSign digital certificate. I need the full accounting ledger, specifically the routing and transit numbers used to clear that initial deposit. That is proprietary billing information, Pierce countered, though his objection sounded weak. It is evidence in an identity theft investigation, I corrected him. Send me the expanded ledger or my next phone call is to the Delaware Attorney General. He did not argue further. He understood the liability his firm was currently exposed to. He asked me to hold. I sat at my desk, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioning vent above my cubicle. 2 minutes later, he returned to the line. I have transmitted the requested file to the email address on record, he said. We will pause the civil filing for 48 hours pending your review. Do not contact my command again, I said, and disconnected the call. I opened my secure email inbox. The new message from Sterling & Associates contained a much larger PDF file. This was not just the summary page. This was the raw, unedited transaction history, the digital DNA of Haley's wedding. I opened the document. I bypassed the forged signature page. I ignored the itemized catering costs and the floral arrangements. I scrolled directly to the bottom of the file, searching for the initial deposit receipt. I found it on page 14. 6 months prior to the wedding date, a payment of $5,000 had been submitted through an automated clearinghouse transfer to reserve the Wilmington Country Club ballroom. I focused on the banking details listed beneath the payment confirmation. There was a 9-digit routing transit number and a masked account number. In the United States banking system, the first 2 digits of a routing number indicate the Federal Reserve District where the institution is headquartered. I typed the 9 digits into a financial lookup directory on my secondary monitor. The system identified the bank instantly. It was a digital-first financial institution, a platform heavily favored by day traders, cryptocurrency investors, and people who operate outside traditional brick-and-mortar banking structures. This detail was crucial. My parents did not use digital banks. Richard and Susan still drove to a local credit union branch to deposit physical paper checks. They still used a physical ledger to balance their monthly budget. They would not possess an account at a modern app-based trading bank. I looked back at the deposit receipt on the PDF. Beneath the routing details, the venue's accounting software had captured the name registered to the Origin bank account. The name of the person who actually wired the $5,000 to secure the wedding date? It was not Susan. It was not Haley. I stared at the letters printed on the screen. The name attached to the deposit account was Trevor. Trevor. I leaned forward, my face inches from the monitor. The name sat there in cold digital ink on the 14th page of the corporate ledger. Trevor, the new husband, the golden boy of the extended family. To understand why this single piece of data shifted the entire tectonic foundation of the fraud, you have to understand the character Trevor had played since the day Haley introduced him. Trevor was 29 years old. He drove a pristine late-model German luxury sedan. He wore tailored suits to casual family barbecues. He spoke with supreme confidence about market volatility short selling and the future of decentralized finance. He presented himself as a highly successful independent day trader who had cracked the code of modern wealth. My mother, Susan, adored him. She constantly bragged to Aunt Patricia and the rest of the family about her daughter marrying a financial prodigy. He was the perfect wealthy groom. But wealthy grooms do not steal their sister-in-law's Social Security number to pay for a catering bill. I opened a new tab on my browser. I bypassed the standard background check websites. Those platforms aggregate basic public information, mostly traffic tickets and old addresses. I needed the heavy machinery. I logged into a specialized legal database utilized by auditors and federal investigators to track civil litigation, corporate bankruptcies, and outstanding municipal judgments. I typed his full legal name into the query field. I selected the state of Pennsylvania, filtering the search down to the county jurisdiction surrounding his downtown Philadelphia apartment complex. I pressed enter. The database generated a list of returns. I ignored the minor entries, a dismissed parking violation from 3 years ago, an old lease agreement. I scanned down to the civil court filings. There it was, a massive red flag flashing on the screen. A civil judgment filed 18 months ago in the Philadelphia County Court of Common Pleas. The plaintiff listed on the docket was a major institutional cryptocurrency exchange. The defendant was Trevor. I clicked the docket number to expand the details of the filing. I read the summary of the complaint. Trevor was not a financial prodigy. He was a gambler. He had engaged in highly leveraged margin trading on a volatile cryptocurrency platform. Margin trading is essentially borrowing money from the broker to place a massive bet on the direction of an asset. If the bet goes bad, the broker issues a margin call, demanding immediate repayment of the borrowed funds. Trevor's bet went catastrophic. The market crashed. The exchange issued a margin call. Trevor did not have the capital to cover his position. The exchange sued him. He failed to appear in court to defend himself. The judge issued a default judgment against him. The total amount owed, including principal, interest, and legal fees, was $90,000. Trevor was bankrupt. He was drowning in a 6-figure debt that he could not discharge. He was a financial ghost, hiding behind a rented German sedan and tailored suits. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with terrifying precision. The timeline aligned perfectly. 18 months ago, the exact moment the civil judgment was filed against Trevor, was the exact same month the withdrawals from my father's medical fund shifted. That was when the $800 deposits stopped going to Haley's luxury shopping trips and started funneling directly into cryptocurrency exchanges. My parents had not stolen my money just to spoil Haley. They had stolen my money to bail out Trevor. Susan had diverted my hard-earned military salary to keep the facade of the wealthy groom alive. But even my stolen money was not enough to plug a $90,000 hole. When the medical fund ran dry, Susan and Richard took out the second mortgage on their home, extracting $165,000 in equity. They handed that money to Trevor to settle the debt and maintain the illusion. By the time the wedding approached, the parents were broke. The medical fund was drained. The equity was gone. And Trevor needed a wedding to match his fake persona. He needed the Wilmington Country Club. He needed the prime rib and the 8-piece cover band to prove to everyone he was successful. When the venue demanded a financial guarantor, Susan did not hatch the identity theft plot on her own. My mother, who struggles to attach a PDF to an email, did not possess the technical knowledge to execute a geolocation-spoofed DocuSign forgery. She did not know how to intercept an IP address or create a dummy email server. Trevor did. Trevor was the architect. He used the $5,000 remaining from the second mortgage to pay the initial deposit from his digital bank account. Then he sat on his velvet sofa in Philadelphia, took my stolen tax documents from Susan, and built the digital trap to secure the remaining $23,000. He married Haley not out of love, but because Susan convinced him that my steady military salary was a limitless trust fund he could exploit. Trevor was not a victim of my mother's manipulation. He was the mastermind pulling her strings. I sat back in my chair. The logistics office was empty. The sun was setting outside the window, casting long shadows across the tarmac of the airbase. I had unraveled the entire conspiracy. I had the bank statements. I had the DocuSign IP logs. I had the $90,000 default judgment. The audit was complete. I reached for my phone to call the venue's lawyer, Mr. Pierce. I intended to send him the docket number for Trevor's bankruptcy. I wanted Sterling and Associates to know exactly who they should be suing for their catering bill. Before I could dial the number, the screen lit up with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed an unknown number with a Philadelphia area code. I swiped the green icon and held the phone to my ear. I did not speak. "Cleo," a voice said. It was deep, tight, with barely controlled panic. It was Trevor. He did not sound like the confident day trader who charmed Aunt Patricia at the summer barbecues. He sounded like a man who had just realized the floor was collapsing beneath him. "The venue lawyer just called my cell," Trevor said, his breathing rapid and shallow. "Pierce said you demanded the routing numbers for the initial deposit. He said you are claiming identity theft. What are you doing, Cleo? You are going to ruin everything." I remained silent. I let his panic fill the empty space on the line. "You need to call Pierce back right now," Trevor demanded. "You need to tell him it was a misunderstanding. You need to authorize the payment. If you do not fix this, I am coming down there to make you fix it." I lowered the phone from my ear. I tapped the red button to end the call. Trevor knew his digital footprint had been exposed. He knew the routing numbers linked him directly to the fraudulent contract. The lawyer's phone call had stripped away his final layer of protection. He was cornered, desperate, and bankrupt. And a desperate man whose entire life is built on a lie will do whatever it takes to silence the person holding the truth. I looked at the clock on my computer monitor. It was 6:15 p.m. Trevor lived in downtown Philadelphia. The drive from his luxury apartment to my apartment complex in Maryland would take exactly 2 hours. He was already on the highway. I packed my laptop into my leather briefcase. I exited the logistics building at Dover Air Base. The drive from the federal installation to my apartment complex in Maryland usually takes 45 minutes. I drove the exact speed limit the entire way. I did not rush. I did not grip the steering wheel with white knuckles. I treated the commute like any other Friday evening. I knew exactly what was waiting for me at the end of the route. When you strip away a con artist's primary source of revenue, their behavior becomes highly predictable. Trevor was a man whose entire identity rested on a crumbling foundation of other people's money. He had stolen my medical fund to pay his debts. He had stolen my identity to pay for his wedding. He had used my mother as a willing accomplice. Now the corporate lawyers were circling the venue, was demanding their cash, and his digital footprint was exposed. He had no money left to fix the problem. His only remaining currency was fear. I pulled my sedan into the asphalt parking lot of my residential complex. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the area bathed in the dim yellow glow of the sodium streetlights. The illumination was uneven, casting long, dense shadows between the parked vehicles and the brick facades of the apartment buildings. I guided my car into my designated space. I turned off the ignition. The engine ticked softly as it began to cool in the humid night air. I unbuckled my seatbelt, picked up my briefcase from the passenger seat, and pushed the driver's side door open. Footsteps crunched heavily on the loose gravel to my left. A figure detached from the darkness near the community dumpster enclosure. It was Trevor. He wore a dark hooded sweatshirt and denim jeans. It was a stark departure from the tailored European suits and silk ties he paraded around in at family holiday gatherings. He looked disheveled. His posture was rigid, his shoulders hunched forward. He closed the distance between us in long, rapid strides, intentionally cutting off my path to the illuminated concrete stairwell leading up to my unit. Trevor stood 6'2". I am 5'6". He positioned himself mere inches from my personal space, forcing me to tilt my head back to look at his face. He planted his feet wide, boxing me in against the side of my vehicle. He was attempting to use his height and physical proximity to force submission. This is a common tactic among individuals who lack intellectual leverage. When the lies stop working, they revert to primitive physical posturing. I could smell the sharp tang of nervous sweat cutting through his expensive designer cologne. His breathing was shallow and erratic. "What do you think you are doing, Cleo?" he demanded. His voice was a harsh, jagged whisper in the quiet parking lot. "You are destroying my marriage. You are destroying your parents. I told you to call Pierce back and fix the billing issue." I did not step back. I did not shrink away. I leaned my lower spine against the cold metal of my car door. I crossed my arms loosely over my chest. I lifted my left wrist a fraction of an inch. I tapped the digital face of my Apple Watch with my right index finger. The small screen illuminated briefly in the dark. The voice memo application engaged. The internal microphone began capturing the ambient noise of the cicadas in the nearby trees, the distant hum of highway traffic, and the heavy, aggressive breathing of the man standing over me. "I am not fixing anything, Trevor," I said. My tone remained flat, entirely devoid of emotion. "The catering bill belongs to the individuals who signed the contract. You are the guarantor," he sneered, leaning his face closer to mine. "Your name is on the document. If you do not unfreeze that bank account right now, I will make your life a living hell. I will drag your reputation through the mud. I will tell everyone in your military command that you are a thief and a liar. You are going to assume this debt today, or I am going to ruin you." I let him finish. I let the digital microphone capture every single syllable of his threat. I waited for the echo of his words to fade into the night air. "Trevor," I said, keeping my gaze locked directly onto his eyes, "are you familiar with the Philadelphia County Court of Common Pleas?" The aggressive posture wavered. The muscles in his jaw tightened. His eyes darted to the left for a fraction of a second before snapping back to me. "What are you talking about?" "Docket number CV2022045991, I recited. The numbers rolled off my tongue with practiced, deliberate precision. A civil complaint filed by a cryptocurrency exchange for unpaid margin calls. A default judgment entered against you 18 months ago. $90,000 in principal, interest, and legal penalties." The color drained from his face. The intimidating shadow he tried to cast shrank instantly. "You do not have a financial portfolio, Trevor," I continued. "You have a mountain of unpayable debt. You are legally bankrupt. You married my sister because Susan convinced you my military salary was a limitless trust fund. You orchestrated the DocuSign forgery because your own credit score is a toxic wasteland." He took a half step back, creating space between us. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was no longer dealing with the quiet, compliant sister-in-law who stood by while the family ignored her. He was standing face to face with the federal auditor who had dissected his entire life down to the penny. "You drove across the state line tonight to confront me," I said, uncrossing my arms and stepping away from the car. "You stood in my driveway in the dark. You demanded, I assume, a $23,000 financial obligation under the threat of reputational destruction." He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "In the state of Maryland," I explained, "that is classified as criminal extortion. Because you crossed from Pennsylvania through Delaware to get here, it elevates the action to a federal offense under the Hobbs Act." I raised my left wrist. I tapped the watch face a second time, stopping the recording and automatically saving the audio file to my secure cloud server. "I have every single word of your threat recorded," I said. "If you ever contact me again, if you ever step foot near my residence or my place of work, I will hand this audio file, the DocuSign IP logs, and your bankruptcy docket directly to the federal authorities. You will not just lose your fake day trader persona, you will lose your freedom. Now get off my property." Trevor did not argue. He did not issue another threat. His hands were shaking, visible in the glow of the streetlights. He turned around and walked briskly toward a dark sedan parked illegally near the complex exit. He pulled his phone from his pocket as he walked. I watched him dial a number and press the device to his ear. I knew exactly who he was calling. He was calling Susan. He was reporting back to his co-conspirator. He was telling my mother that the physical intimidation tactic had failed. He was telling her that I possessed all the banking data, the metadata, and a recorded confession of his extortion attempt. I walked up the concrete stairs to my apartment, unlocked the door, and set my briefcase on the entryway table. The confrontation was over, but the war was about to escalate to its most dangerous phase. Susan would receive Trevor's phone call and realize I was an impenetrable fortress. I could not be bullied. I could not be shamed by the extended family. I could not be threatened in a dark parking lot. I was immune to their standard weapons. When a predator realizes their target is wearing armor, they stop attacking the armor. They look for the unprotected vulnerability. Susan knew my personal life was secure. She knew my finances were locked down. So she decided to bypass my personal boundaries entirely. She decided to launch a direct strike against the only thing I truly valued. She decided to go after my career, my security clearance, and my livelihood at the Department of Defense. The weekend passed in a heavy, deliberate silence. I did not receive any more texts from Haley. The extended family group chats remained dormant. Trevor did not return to the parking lot. The absence of noise was not a victory lap. It was the calm before an artillery strike. I spent Saturday and Sunday compiling hard copies of the digital evidence, printing the spreadsheets, the DocuSign logs, the bank statements, and the court dockets. I placed every document into clear plastic sleeves within a thick black leather binder. I indexed the sections with color-coded tabs. Monday morning arrived. I woke up at 5, ran my standard route, drank my coffee, and put on my uniform. I drove the 45 minutes to Dover Air Base. The morning routine broke the moment my tires hit the primary security checkpoint. I rolled down my window and handed my Department of Defense identification card to the military police officer manning the booth. He swiped the barcode through his handheld scanner. The device typically emits a short, high-pitched chirp followed by a green light. This time, the scanner emitted a harsh, prolonged buzz. The light flashed a solid, aggressive red. The officer looked at the screen, then looked down at me. His posture stiffened immediately. He rested his right hand lightly on his duty belt. "Ma'am, please turn off the vehicle engine and step out of the car," he ordered. His voice was all business, stripped of the usual morning pleasantries. I did exactly as instructed. I turned the key, pulled the emergency brake, and stepped onto the pavement. 2 additional officers emerged from the guard shack. They did not draw their weapons, but their formation was designed to prevent any sudden movements. "Please place your hands on the roof of the vehicle," the lead officer instructed. I complied. I felt the cold metal of the car roof under my palms. I was not afraid. I knew exactly what was happening. Susan had pulled her final lever. My mother had realized her extortion tactics were useless, so she weaponized the federal government against me. To maintain a high-level security clearance within the Department of Defense, personnel are subject to continuous evaluation. Any allegation of criminal conduct, financial instability, or severe moral turpitude triggers an immediate suspension of access. An auditor accused of financial crimes is instantly removed from the logistical network to protect classified supply chain data. Susan had called the Department of Defense Inspector General hotline. She had filed a formal, documented complaint. She had accused me of financial elder abuse, claiming I had manipulated my vulnerable parents, stolen their money, and was leveraging my military position to intimidate them. She assumed a federal investigation would terrify me into submission. She assumed the threat of losing my career would force me to pay the catering bill to make the investigation disappear. An unmarked gray sedan pulled up to the security checkpoint. A man wearing a dark suit and a silver identification badge stepped out. He approached the officers, flashed his credentials, and turned to me. "Ms. Bell," he said, his tone neutral and bureaucratic, "I am Special Agent Miller with the Criminal Investigation Division. Your base access has been temporarily suspended pending an inquiry into a severe hotline complaint. You need to come with me." I nodded, lowered my hands from the roof of my car, and retrieved my leather binder from the passenger seat. I sat in the back of the gray sedan as Agent Miller drove us to a nondescript administrative building near the edge of the base perimeter. He escorted me down a narrow hallway and into a small, windowless interrogation room. The walls were painted a dull institutional gray. A metal table sat in the center of the room, flanked by two rigid chairs. A camera lens blinked with a tiny red light in the upper corner of the ceiling. "Have a seat," Miss Bell, Miller instructed. I sat down. I placed the thick black binder squarely in the center of the metal table. Miller took the seat across from me. He opened a manila folder and arranged a stack of papers. He looked at me, assessing my demeanor. He was likely accustomed to service members breaking down in tears, protesting their innocence, or displaying visible signs of panic when faced with career-ending allegations. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded over the leather cover of my binder. "Ms. Bell," he began, consulting his notes. "We received a detailed complaint from a civilian identified as Susan Bell, your mother. The complaint alleges a pattern of severe financial elder abuse. She claims you have restricted her access to critical medical funds, forced her to sign fraudulent contracts under duress, and have recently engaged in threatening behavior toward her family members." He paused, letting the weight of the accusations hang in the sterile air of the room. "These are serious allegations. If substantiated, they will result in the immediate revocation of your security clearance and possible referral for federal prosecution." I looked him directly in the eyes. "I understand the severity of the allegations, Agent Miller. I also understand the federal statutes regarding the filing of a false official statement to a government agency." I opened the heavy cover of my binder. "May I proceed?" I asked. Miller leaned back slightly, surprised by my composure. "Go ahead." I flipped to the first color-coded tab, red. "The complaint alleges I restricted access to medical funds," I stated, sliding a stack of highlighted bank statements across the metal table. "These documents detail 48 months of automated transfers from my military salary account to a joint checking account, a total of $38,400. The funds were designated for my father's cardiovascular medication." Miller scanned the top page. "I direct your attention to the vendor columns," I continued. "You will not find a single medical expense. You will find transactions for luxury resorts, designer apparel, and significant capital transfers to a cryptocurrency exchange platform. The medical condition was fabricated to extract funds from my salary. I did not restrict access to a medical account. I terminated a 4-year financial exploitation campaign upon discovering the fraud." Miller's eyes narrowed. He flipped through the next 3 pages of the bank statements, his forensic training recognizing the pattern of illicit transfers. I flipped to the second tab, blue. "The complaint alleges I forced my mother to sign fraudulent contracts under duress," I said, sliding the corporate demand letter from Sterling and Associates across the table, followed immediately by the DocuSign metadata logs. "This is a $23,000 catering contract for my sister's wedding. It bears my name and my social security number. It was executed electronically. I pointed a pen at the highlighted IP address on the metadata log. The geolocation data embedded in the digital certificate proves this contract was executed from a residential high-rise in downtown Philadelphia. I was on duty at this installation at the exact time the signature was stamped. The routing numbers used for the initial holding deposit belonged to a digital bank account registered to my sister's husband, Trevor. My mother and her son-in-law stole my tax documents, spoofed my identity, and committed felony wire fraud to fund a wedding they could not afford. Miller stared at the IP logs. The skepticism in his posture vanished entirely, replaced by the sharp focus of a seasoned investigator looking at undeniable physical evidence. I flipped to the final tab, yellow. The complaint alleges I have engaged in threatening behavior toward my family, I said. I pulled my mobile phone from my pocket. I unlocked the screen, opened the cloud storage application, and selected the audio file I recorded in the parking lot. I placed the phone on the table and pressed play. The clear digital recording of the dark parking lot filled the small room. The sound of the cicadas, Trevor's aggressive breathing, the explicit recorded demand for me to assume the $23,000 debt under the threat of reputational destruction and career sabotage. The audio file ended. I hit pause. That man is Trevor, I explained. He is currently carrying a $90,000 default judgment for a failed crypto margin call. He orchestrated the DocuSign forgery, and when the corporate lawyers started asking questions, he drove across state lines to extort me in my driveway. When I refused to comply, my mother called your hotline and filed a false report in a desperate attempt to weaponize my security clearance against me. I closed the heavy cover of the binder. I have not committed elder abuse, Agent Miller. I am the victim of a coordinated, multi-state financial conspiracy executed by my immediate family. Agent Miller sat in silence for a long time. He looked at the bank statements. He looked at the IP metadata. He looked at my phone. He closed his manila folder. He did not ask any follow-up questions. He did not request a written statement. The evidence was absolute, categorized, and lethal. He slid the documents back across the table. Ms. Bell, he said, his voice dropping the bureaucratic tone entirely. I have conducted hundreds of these interviews. I have seen families do terrible things to each other over money. But the level of calculation required to forge a contract, steal a medical fund, and then file a false IG complaint to destroy a military career is beyond the pale. He stood up from the table. Your clearance is safe, he assured me. I will close this inquiry unfounded by the end of the hour. Your base access will be restored immediately. He walked to the door, placed his hand on the metal handle, and turned back to look at me. The investigator's protocol slipped away, replaced by the raw, practical advice of a law enforcement professional looking at a crime victim. You need to take this binder to the civilian authorities, Ms. Bell. You need to file the felony charges today. Do not wait for the corporate lawyers to sue your parents. You need to burn their entire operation to the ground before they try another angle. I nodded, placed the documents back into my briefcase, and walked out of the interrogation room. The federal government had just given me permission to drop the hammer. I left the base, drove my sedan directly into the city limits, and parked in front of the local police precinct. It was time to transfer the legal liability back to the people who created it. I pulled out of Dover Air Base and merged onto the highway. The drive to the local municipal police department took 12 minutes. The midday sun glared off the asphalt, heating the interior of my sedan, despite the air conditioning running at full capacity. I navigated through the downtown traffic, located the brick exterior of the precinct, and parked in the visitor lot. The air inside the station smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. I approached the front desk, presented my military identification to the dispatcher behind the bulletproof glass, and requested to speak with a detective regarding felony identity theft and wire fraud. 10 minutes later, a uniformed officer escorted me through a set of double security doors and into the detective bureau. The room was a labyrinth of gray desks, filing cabinets, and ringing telephones. I was directed to a desk near the back wall. Detective Russo sat behind a dual-monitor setup. He wore a faded blue dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked tired. When I sat down across from him, he offered a polite but strained smile. He likely assumed I was there to report a stolen credit card or a petty domestic squabble. Police departments handle dozens of family disputes every week, most of which are messy, emotional, and devoid of actionable evidence. Family financial disagreements are often difficult to prosecute, Ms. Bell Russo said, leaning back in his chair. Usually these things belong in small claims court. Unless you have hard proof of criminal intent, the district attorney is hesitant to take the case. I did not offer a verbal rebuttal. I unzipped my leather briefcase, extracted the thick black binder, and placed it squarely on his desk. The heavy thud of the binder hitting the wood veneer interrupted his speech. "This is not a dispute over a borrowed lawnmower, Detective," I said. My pulse remained steady. I opened the cover and flipped to the first index tab. "This is a multi-state conspiracy involving the theft of personal identifiable information, the forgery of a $23,000 corporate contract, and documented extortion across state lines." Russo sat forward. The tired demeanor vanished. I walked him through the timeline. I showed him the bank records detailing the extraction of the medical funds. I explained how Susan harvested my Social Security number from my discarded tax documents. I laid out the printed DocuSign metadata, pointing directly to the IP address anchored to the luxury high-rise in Philadelphia. I showed him the routing numbers, proving Trevor funded the initial venue deposit. Then I played the audio recording of Trevor standing in my parking lot, demanding I assume the debt under the threat of blackmail. Russo did not interrupt me once. He took notes on a yellow legal pad, his pen moving rapidly across the paper. When I finished presenting the evidence, he looked at the open binder, then looked up at me. "You built the entire case file," he said, his voice laced with genuine respect. "Most victims come in here with a gut feeling and a lot of tears. You brought me a forensic roadmap." "I'm an auditor," I replied. "I prefer a paper trail." Russo opened a drawer and retrieved a stack of formal complaint forms. He began filling out the incident report numbers. He explained the legal mechanics of what would happen next. Because the forgery utilized the internet to transmit the fraudulent contract from Pennsylvania to Delaware, the crime met the criteria for wire fraud. Because Trevor drove to my residence to deliver his threat, it met the criteria for extortion. He handed me a sworn affidavit. This document required me to attest under penalty of perjury that the allegations were factual and that I desired to press criminal charges against my mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law. I picked up the pen from his desk. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a sudden rush of familial guilt. I pressed the ballpoint to the paper and signed my name, the exact same name my mother had forged to steal my future. Russo took the affidavit, stamped it with an official seal, and provided me with a carbon copy, along with the primary incident report number. He informed me he would be forwarding the file to the district attorney to draft the arrest warrants. I thanked him, packed my binder, and walked out of the precinct. I returned to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and tethered my laptop to my mobile phone hotspot. I had one final administrative task to complete before the trap snapped shut. I opened my email client and drafted a new message to Gregory Pierce, the senior counsel for Sterling & Associates. I kept the text brief and clinical. I informed him that formal criminal charges had been filed regarding the fraudulent catering contract. I attached a scanned copy of the police report and the sworn affidavit. I hit send. I did not have to wait long. My phone rang less than 5 minutes later. The caller ID displayed the corporate law firm, Ms. Bell Pierce said. His tone had undergone a radical transformation. The predatory arrogance from our previous conversation was gone. He sounded clinical, detached, and highly efficient. "I have reviewed the police report and the attached affidavit. I assume this concludes your attempt to collect the venue balance from my accounts," I said. "Yes," Pierce confirmed. "Sterling & Associates is officially dropping you as the respondent in this matter. We have closed your file. However, our client still suffered a loss of services rendered. We will be redirecting our collection efforts." He did not have to explain his strategy. I understood the mechanics of debt recovery. Since the criminal investigation identified Susan and Richard as the primary beneficiaries of the stolen services, the law firm would pivot their legal strike. Pierce informed me they were drafting a civil suit against my parents. Because my parents lacked the liquid cash to settle a $23,000 judgment, the firm would seek a mechanic's lien against their primary residence. A lien is a legal claim placed on a property. It prevents the owners from selling or refinancing the house until the debt is paid in full. If the debt remains unpaid, the law firm can force a foreclosure sale to recover their client's money. The consequences of the forgery had just transferred back to the architects. My parents' financial world was entering an uncontrolled freefall. Their cash reserves were non-existent. The $165,000 equity from their second mortgage was already drained. Now, a ruthless corporate attorney was attaching a lien to the very walls of their home, ensuring they could not escape the catering debt. Simultaneously, a police detective was compiling a warrant for their arrest. The walls were closing in rapidly. I drove back to my apartment and enjoyed a quiet evening. I cooked dinner. I read a book. I slept for 8 uninterrupted hours. The silence broke the following afternoon. My phone illuminated on the coffee table. The caller ID displayed Aunt Patricia. I let it ring 3 times before answering. I knew the smear campaign had failed. I knew the aggressive text messages from the extended family had ceased because Susan was no longer feeding them a false narrative. Susan was too busy panicking, Cleo Patricia said. Her voice was unrecognizable. It lacked the haughty, judgmental edge from her previous messages. She sounded strained, anxious, and deeply unsettled. "Hello, Patricia. Please do not hang up," she pleaded. "I know you are angry. I know the things I said in my text were harsh. Susan told me a story, and I reacted poorly, but things have gotten out of hand." I remained quiet, allowing her to fill the space. "Susan called me this morning." Patricia continued, her words rushing together. "She is terrified, Cleo. She said lawyers are threatening to take her house. She said the police called her and asked her to come in for questioning. She is talking about jail time. This is destroying your father." "Actions have corresponding reactions," I stated. "You are a family," Patricia insisted. "You cannot send your own mother to prison over a wedding bill." Susan wants to make this right. She wants to apologize. She begged me to host a dinner at my house tomorrow night. Just you, your parents, Haley and Trevor. A private setting to figure out a payment plan and resolve this before the authorities take it any further. I stared out the window of my living room. A reconciliation dinner. It was a classic Trojan horse. Susan was not looking for forgiveness. She was looking for a contained environment where she could deploy her final weapon. She wanted to be in a room surrounded by weeping relatives, relying on the immense emotional pressure of a family dinner to force me into signing a liability waiver. She needed me to retract the police report. Patricia was acting as the unwitting broker for an ambush. "I will be there," I told her. "Let me know what time." "I will be there," I told Patricia. "Let me know what time." I was about to disconnect the call when Patricia let out a long, shuddering sigh. It was the sound of a woman buckling under the weight of an unexpected burden. "I just want this nightmare to end, Cleo," she murmured. Her voice cracked slightly. "Your mother is completely falling apart. I have never seen her this desperate, and quite frankly, I am not equipped to handle this level of crisis right now. I have my own financial problems to worry about." I frowned, the phone pressed tightly against my ear. "What financial problems?" Patricia hesitated. In our family, admitting financial weakness was akin to admitting a moral failure. But the stress of the situation overrode her pride. "The storm damage from last spring," she confessed. "The insurance company fought me tooth and nail over the roof replacement claim. They refused to cover the full cost. Susan stepped in and paid $10,000 to the roofing contractor out of her own pocket to keep the house from sustaining water damage. I have been trying to scrape together the money to pay her back, and now this catering disaster hits. She needs that $10,000 to pay the venue, and I simply do not have it to give her." My analytical mind, which had been resting comfortably, snapped back to full operational capacity. Patricia believed she owed Susan $10,000 for a roof repair. I kept my voice absolutely neutral. "When exactly did Susan pay the contractor, Patricia?" "Oh, it was right around mid-March," she replied, sounding confused by the specific question. "She said she tapped into her emergency savings because she knew I was struggling." "Why does that matter?" It matters because I want to make sure the accounting is accurate before we sit down for dinner, I said smoothly. I will see you tomorrow night at 6. I hung up the phone. I walked straight to my home office desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up the master spreadsheet. I cross-referenced the timeline. The wedding occurred in mid-July. The DocuSign forgery was executed in April. Patricia stated Susan paid the roofer in mid-March. I opened the bank statements from my father's medical fund, the account I had been funding with $800 a month. I scanned the transactions for the month of March. There were no withdrawals totaling $10,000. The medical account was already drained by the escalating luxury expenses and Trevor's crypto funneling. I needed to see the broader financial picture. I utilized my access to a municipal permit database, a public resource that tracks all major residential construction and contractor activity within a specified county. To legally replace a roof, a licensed contractor must pull a permit. I typed Patricia's address into the search bar. The system returned 0 results for a roof replacement at that property within the last 5 years. I stared at the screen. The math did not align. If there was no permit, there was no licensed contractor. If there was no contractor, there was no $10,000 invoice. Susan had not paid for a new roof. I analyzed the timeline again, focusing specifically on the month of March. What significant financial event occurred within that specific 30-day window? The realization hit me like a physical blow. March was the exact month my parents finalized the second mortgage on their home, extracting $165,000 in equity. But the timeline was tight. Bank underwriting takes weeks. They needed a cash bridge to cover their immediate expenses, the mortgage closing costs, the appraisal fees, or perhaps Trevor needed an emergency cash injection to keep the crypto exchange from freezing his remaining assets before the big payout arrived. Susan needed liquid cash fast. She did not give Patricia $10,000. She stole it from her. My mother had recognized Patricia's vulnerability regarding the insurance claim. Susan likely convinced Patricia to hand over the $10,000, promising to pool the money with her own funds to secure a better rate with a fictional contractor she knew. Once the cash was transferred, Susan diverted it to plug the holes in her own sinking ship. When Patricia asked about the roof, Susan probably blamed supply chain delays or contractor scheduling conflicts, buying time until the second mortgage cleared. Patricia was not the enemy orchestrating the smear campaign. She was the victim of a parallel con. My mother had weaponized Patricia's loyalty, feeding her a false narrative about my behavior at the wedding, while simultaneously holding her hostage over a phantom debt. Susan created an illusion where Patricia felt obligated to defend the woman who was actively stealing from her. I closed the municipal permit database. The upcoming reconciliation dinner was no longer just an ambush designed to force my compliance. It was an opportunity to dismantle the entire operation in a single stroke. The next evening, I prepared for the dinner with the same meticulous attention to detail I apply before briefing a general officer on a supply chain failure. I selected a tailored charcoal gray suit. The fabric was structured, presenting sharp, uncompromising lines. I wore a crisp white blouse. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe knot. My appearance communicated authority, professionalism, and an absolute refusal to engage in emotional theatrics. I packed my leather briefcase. Inside the primary compartment, I placed the printed DocuSign metadata, the 48 months of medical fund bank statements, the audio recording transcript of Trevor's driveway extortion, the corporate demand letter from Sterling & Associates, and the police affidavit bearing the incident report number. I added one final document to the stack, a printed copy of the municipal permit search proving no roof work had ever been authorized at Patricia's residence. I locked the briefcase clasp. The drive from my apartment in Maryland to Patricia's home in Delaware took exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes. I did not listen to music. I did not listen to a podcast. I drove in silence, mentally rehearsing the timeline, ensuring every data point was secured in my memory. I pulled into Patricia's quiet suburban neighborhood just as the sun began to set. The streetlights flickered to life, casting an amber glow over the manicured lawns. I parked my sedan at the curb. The driveway was full. My parents' silver crossover sat near the garage door. Behind it, parked at an aggressive angle, was Trevor's rented German luxury sedan. The players had arrived. The illusion of forgiveness was the bait. Susan had convinced Patricia to host this gathering under the guise of family healing. They expected me to walk through the front door carrying a burden of guilt. They expected the weight of the familial gaze to crush my resolve. They expected to isolate me in the dining room, surround me with emotional pressure, and slide a liability waiver across the table. They were preparing for a tearful reconciliation. I was preparing for a kinetic strike. I stepped out of my car. The evening air was still and warm. I retrieved my leather briefcase from the passenger seat. I felt the comforting weight of the handle in my grip. I walked up the concrete path leading to Patricia's front porch. The windows of the house glowed with warm, inviting light. I could hear the faint murmur of conversation from inside. It sounded like a normal family gathering. It was a meticulously constructed facade. I reached the front door. I did not knock. I pressed the doorbell. The faint sound of a chime echoed inside. The murmuring ceased instantly. I heard the sound of footsteps approaching the entryway. The deadbolt clicked. The handle turned. The door swung open, revealing the interior of the house. Patricia stood in the foyer wearing a forced, anxious smile. Behind her, visible through the archway leading into the formal dining room, the trap was set. My mother sat at the head of the long oak table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. My father sat to her right, staring blankly at his empty plate. And seated directly across from them, presenting a united front, were Haley and Trevor. Patricia stepped aside, ushering me into the foyer. Her anxious smile remained plastered on her face, a brittle mask covering the underlying tension. "Come in, Cleo," she said, her voice slightly higher than usual. "Everyone is waiting. Dinner is almost ready." I stepped onto the hardwood floor. I did not return the smile. I carried the leather briefcase in my right hand, allowing it to rest against my leg. I followed Patricia through the archway and into the formal dining room. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, thick, with a suffocating, manufactured warmth. The overhead chandelier cast a bright, unforgiving light across the long oak table. The china was arranged perfectly. The water glasses were full. It was a stage set for a highly choreographed performance. What the people sitting around that table did not know, what they could not possibly comprehend as they watched me walk into the room, was that 10 minutes prior to ringing the doorbell, I had sent a secure text message to Detective Russo at the municipal precinct. I had provided Patricia's address and confirmed my arrival. I was not walking into a trap. I was baiting one. I took the single empty chair situated at the far end of the table, directly opposite my mother. I placed my briefcase on the floor beside my feet. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and raw. My mother, Susan, broke the quiet. She offered a fragile, trembling smile. "It is so good to see you, Cleo," she said, her voice laced with practiced vulnerability. "We are so glad you decided to come. We just want to put all of this ugliness behind us." Haley, seated next to Trevor, refused to look at me. She stared fixedly at the intricate pattern on her china plate. Trevor sat rigidly, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting between my face and the briefcase resting on the floor. He knew the threat I carried, but he remained silent, trusting Susan to execute the final maneuver. My father, Richard, cleared his throat. He sat up straighter in his chair, adjusting his posture to convey authority. In our family dynamic, Richard usually remained passive, allowing Susan to steer the ship. But when the situation required a patriarchal decree, he stepped into the role. "This has been a difficult week for everyone," Richard began, his tone pompous and rehearsed. "Tempers have flared, mistakes have been made on all sides, but at the end of the day, we are a family." He looked around the table, ensuring he had an attentive audience. "Family requires sacrifice," he continued, emphasizing the final word. "It requires understanding. When one part of the family struggles, the rest of the family steps up to support them. That is the fundamental contract of blood. We do not turn our backs on each other over financial misunderstandings. We do not involve outsiders in private family business." I listened to his speech without changing my expression. A financial misunderstanding. That was their internal classification for felony identity theft and wire fraud. "We need to heal," Richard concluded, looking directly at me. "We need to move forward together." Susan took her cue. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan sweater and withdrew a folded piece of paper. She smoothed it flat on the oak table, her hands trembling slightly, an intentional display of distress designed to trigger sympathy. She slid the paper across the polished wood. It stopped in front of my empty dinner plate. I looked down at the document. It was not a check to cover the venue bill. It was not a sincere written apology. It was a formal, legal waiver. A single-page document drafted to absolve the undersigned parties of any civil or criminal liability regarding the execution of the country club catering contract. It was a get-out-of-jail-free card. "I know things got complicated, Cleo," Susan said softly, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "But we can fix this right now. If you sign that paper, the venue lawyers will back off. The investigation will disappear. We can figure out a payment plan internally, as a family." She reached into her pocket a second time. She withdrew a pen and slid it across the table to accompany the document. I looked at the pen resting on the oak wood. It was a cheap, transparent plastic ballpoint, the kind you buy in bulk at an office supply store. The ink tube inside was half empty. The plastic cap was slightly chewed at the end. I stared at that cheap plastic pen and a vivid image flashed across my mind. I saw the heavy frosted glass doors of the Wilmington Country Club. I saw the imported white orchids. I saw the champagne flutes catching the light of the chandelier. And I saw the silver foil wristbands wrapped tightly around the forearms of the people deemed worthy of inclusion, the people who were allowed past the velvet rope, the VIP wristbands. They gave the silver wristbands to Haley's college friends. They gave them to Trevor's drinking buddies. They gave them to the people who consumed the prime rib and danced to the 8-piece cover band. And they handed me a piece of paper with a Zoom link. Now facing total financial ruin and federal prosecution, my mother was handing me a cheap plastic pen and demanding I sacrifice my career and my financial security to save the very people who had locked me out. "Just sign it, Cleo." Susan pleaded, leaning forward in her chair. For the family, the emotional coercion in the room was palpable. Patricia watched me with anxious, hopeful eyes, desperate for the tension to break. Richard maintained his stern, authoritative posture. Haley finally looked up, her expression a mix of entitlement and fear. Trevor gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. They expected the compliant daughter to emerge. They expected the strong sister to absorb the blow and fix the deficit. I reached out and picked up the cheap plastic pen. I held it between the thumb and index finger of my right hand. I felt the flimsy, brittle nature of the material. I did not uncap it. I did not move it toward the signature line on the liability waiver. The room held its collective breath. They thought they had won. I looked at my mother. I looked at the tears pooling in her eyes. I looked at the sheer arrogance required to steal a person's identity and then ask them to sign away the crime with a disposable pen. I shifted my grip on the plastic cylinder. I positioned my thumbs in the center and curled my index fingers around the edges. I applied a sharp, sudden pressure. The cheap plastic snapped in half with a loud, distinct crack that echoed off the dining room walls. The sound sliced through the suffocating manufactured warmth like a scalpel. Patricia gasped, a short, sharp intake of air. Richard blinked his pompous demeanor, shattering instantly. Susan recoiled in her chair, the fake tears evaporating, replaced by genuine shock. I dropped the 2 broken halves of the pen onto the center of the legal waiver. I reached down to the floor beside my feet. I grasped the handle of my leather briefcase and lifted it onto the table, placing it directly beside the broken pen. I did not raise my voice. I did not exhibit a single ounce of anger. I maintained the cold, flat tone of an auditor preparing to deliver a terminal assessment. "We are not going to talk about family sacrifice," I said, looking directly at my father. "And we are not going to sign liability waivers." I unlocked the metal clasps on the briefcase. The distinct metallic click resonated in the silent room. We are going to talk about the data I announced, and we are going to start with the $38,400 you stole from me to fund a fake heart condition. I opened the heavy leather cover of the briefcase. The room was absolutely silent. The only sound was the rustle of the thick, high-quality paper as I extracted the first stack of documents from the primary folder. I did not stand up. I remained seated, anchoring my presence at the end of the table. 4 years ago, I began my voice, carrying the steady, relentless cadence of a metronome. I sat in a hospital waiting room and watched my father fake a cardiac event so my mother could secure an automated clearinghouse transfer of $800 a month. I slid the first packet of paper across the polished oak. It stopped precisely in the center of the table, equidistant from everyone. Those are the bank statements I stated. 48 months of transaction history, $38,400. You will not find a single copay or cardiologist fee listed in that ledger. You will find charges for luxury resorts, designer apparel, and significant capital transfers to a digital cryptocurrency exchange. Richard stared at the stack of paper, his jaw hanging slightly open. The pompous authority he had projected moments ago evaporated, leaving behind a frail, exposed old man. Susan pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. Before anyone could mount a defense, I pulled the second document from the briefcase. I looked directly at Patricia. "Aunt Patricia," I said, shifting my focus to the woman who had hosted this ambush under false pretenses. "You mentioned on the phone that Susan paid $10,000 out of pocket to a contractor to repair your storm-damaged roof in mid-March." Patricia nodded slowly, her anxiety spiking as she realized the conversation was turning toward her. I slid a single sheet of paper down the length of the table. It came to rest near Patricia's water glass. "That is a certified printout from the municipal permit database," I explained. "It covers all residential construction activity authorized at your property address for the last 5 years. There are 0 permits pulled for a roof replacement. There was no licensed contractor. There was no $10,000 invoice." Patricia picked up the paper. Her hands shook as she read the stark, irrefutable data. "My parents took out a $165,000 second mortgage in March. I continued ensuring every word landed with maximum impact. They needed a cash bridge to cover their immediate expenses before the bank released the equity. Susan did not pay a contractor to fix your roof, Patricia. She lied to you, took your $10,000, and used it to plug the holes in her own sinking ship. You are not her confidant. You are another victim." Patricia gasped, the sound tearing through the quiet room. She dropped the paper onto the table as if it had burned her fingers. She turned her head slowly, looking at Susan with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. "Susan," Patricia whispered, her voice trembling, "tell me that is not true. Tell me you did not steal my money." Susan did not answer. She could not look her sister in the eye. She stared down at her lap, her silence serving as a devastating admission of guilt. I did not give the room time to process the secondary fraud. The momentum was mine, and I intended to use it to dismantle the primary target. I reached into the briefcase and extracted the third packet of documents, the DocuSign metadata logs and the corporate ledger from Sterling & Associates. I slid the packet toward the center of the table, placing it directly on top of the fake medical fund statements. When the $165,000 equity vanished and the wedding approached, my parents were entirely broke. I stated, addressing the entire room, so they decided to steal my identity to secure a $23,000 country club catering contract. Susan harvested my Social Security number from old tax documents. I pointed a finger at the highlighted IP address on the top page of the packet. But Susan did not possess the technical capability to execute a spoofed electronic forgery, I clarified. That required assistance. That required an architect. The IP address anchored to that forged document traces directly to a luxury high-rise apartment in downtown Philadelphia. The routing numbers used to clear the initial holding deposit belonged to a digital banking platform. I shifted my gaze from the documents to the man sitting rigidly beside my sister. It traces directly to you, Trevor. Trevor's face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. He opened his mouth, attempting to formulate a denial, but the evidence was sitting right in front of him. The digital footprint was undeniable. Haley, who had been staring at her plate in humiliated silence, finally looked up. She turned her head and stared at her husband, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What is she talking about, Trevor?" Haley asked, her voice high and thin. "What IP address?" Trevor did not answer her. He stared at the documents on the table, his chest rising and falling rapidly. I reached into the briefcase one final time. I pulled out the killing blow, the single document that would obliterate the foundational lie of their entire existence. I looked at my younger sister, the bride who believed she was entitled to a $4,000 dress and a country club reception, the bride who believed she had married a wealthy financial prodigy. I slid the document across the table. It stopped directly in front of Haley. "Trevor is not a successful day trader, Haley," I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the heavy, final weight of absolute truth. "He is a financial ghost. That document is a certified docket from the Philadelphia County Court of Common Pleas. It is a civil complaint filed by a cryptocurrency exchange for unpaid margin calls." Haley picked up the paper. Her eyes scanned the legal text. 18 months ago, a judge issued a default judgment against him, I explained, driving the final nail into the coffin. He is currently carrying a $90,000 unpayable debt. He is legally bankrupt. Haley's hands began to shake violently. The paper rattled in her grip. "The money Susan funneled from my fake medical account, I continued the equity from the second mortgage. It did not go into investments. It went to bail out Trevor's failed crypto bets. He married you, Haley, because Susan convinced him that my military salary was a limitless trust fund. He orchestrated the identity theft because his own credit score is a toxic wasteland." I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. "He married you for my money, Haley, and the money is gone." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the terrifying, vacuum-sealed quiet that occurs immediately before an explosion. The house of lies, carefully constructed over 4 years, maintained through manipulation and deceit, had been systematically dismantled in less than 5 minutes by a single leather briefcase and a stack of printed data. Then the table detonated. Haley dropped the court docket, spun in her chair, and screamed at Trevor. Her voice was a shrill, hysterical shriek of absolute fury. "You lied to me. You told me you were rich. You told me you paid for the honeymoon in cash." Trevor pushed his chair back, scrambling to put distance between himself and his enraged wife. "Haley, I can explain. It was a market downturn. I am going to make it back." Haley lunged forward, slapping her hands against his chest, her manicured nails catching the fabric of his shirt. "You forged her signature. You used my apartment. You ruined my life." At the other end of the table, Richard finally found his voice. He stood up, towering over Susan, his face purple with rage. "You told me the medical fund was going into a high-yield savings account for our retirement," he bellowed, his fist slamming down on the oak table. "You gave our home equity to this bankrupt loser." Susan shrank back, covering her head with her arms as if expecting a physical blow. "Richard, I was trying to save the wedding. I was trying to keep the family together." Patricia stood up from her chair, tears streaming down her face. She pointed a trembling finger at her sister. "You stole $10,000 from me, Susan. You stole from your own sister while I was begging the insurance company for help. I am calling my lawyer tomorrow morning." The dining room descended into absolute chaos. The volume in the room was deafening. Haley was sobbing hysterically, hitting Trevor on the shoulder. Trevor was shouting over her, trying to defend his failed margin calls. Richard was screaming at Susan about the second mortgage and the imminent loss of their home. Patricia was crying, demanding her $10,000 back. The unified front was gone. The loyal family unit had vanished. The thieves, stripped of their stolen resources and exposed to the harsh light of reality, had turned on each other like starved wolves fighting over the last scrap of meat. I did not intervene. I did not raise my voice to shout over the din. I sat quietly at the end of the table, watching the destruction unfold. I had not fired a single shot. I had simply handed them the matches and let them burn their own house down. I reached down, picked up my empty leather briefcase, and secured the metal clasps. I stood up from the table. As I turned to walk out of the dining room, a sudden, intense pulse of color illuminated the far wall of the house. I stopped and looked toward the large bay windows facing the street. The amber glow of the neighborhood streetlights was entirely washed out by a rapid, alternating strobe of bright red and piercing blue. The flashing lights bounced off the window panes, casting harsh, moving shadows across the walls of the chaotic dining room. The alternating strobe of bright red and piercing blue lights washed the dining room in a harsh, rhythmic glare. The chaotic screaming around the oak table sputtered to an abrupt halt. The sudden silence was heavier than the shouting. Everyone froze, their faces illuminated in brief, flashing intervals of colored light slicing through the bay windows. A heavy, authoritative knock rattled the front door. 3 distinct, measured strikes against the solid wood. It was not the knock of a neighbor complaining about a noise disturbance. It was the synchronized, practiced rhythm of law enforcement. Patricia stood paralyzed next to her chair. Richard stared at the hallway, his jaw trembling. Susan gripped the edge of the table, the remaining color draining from her cheeks. "Cleo," Susan whispered, her voice cracking with sudden terror. "What did you do? Did you call the police on us?" I picked up my briefcase by the leather handle. I looked down at my mother, a woman who had forged my name, stolen my future, and attempted to strip my security clearance. "I did not call them tonight, Mom," I said smoothly. "I called them 3 days ago. Arrest warrants take time to process through the district attorney. I simply provided the detective with the address of this dinner party to save them a trip to your house." I turned my back on the table and walked out of the dining room. I moved through the foyer and grasped the brass handle of the front door. I pulled it open. Detective Russo stood on the porch. He was flanked by 4 uniformed municipal officers. They wore heavy tactical vests, their radios buzzing with low static dispatches. Russo recognized me immediately. He offered a brief, professional nod. "Are the subjects inside the residence, Ms. Bell?" he asked. "They are in the dining room, Detective," I replied, stepping aside to clear the threshold. The officers moved past me, their heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor. I stood in the foyer, watching the scene unfold from a calculated distance. Russo entered the dining room. He did not raise his voice. He operated with the calm, procedural efficiency of a man executing a routine task. He scanned the faces around the table, holding a printed folder in his left hand. Susan Bell Russo stated, locking his eyes on my mother. "And Trevor Hayes." Trevor pushed his chair back, his hands raised defensively in the air. "Wait a minute," Trevor stammered, his voice pitching high with panic. "There is a misunderstanding here. We were just having a family discussion. We are resolving a civil billing issue." "It is no longer a civil issue, Mr. Hayes," Russo corrected him. The detective opened the folder. He read the warrants aloud, his voice projecting clearly across the room. He informed them they were being placed under arrest. He listed the specific charges: felony identity theft, felony wire fraud, interstate extortion. 2 uniformed officers moved toward Susan. She let out a guttural, panicked sob. She reached out, trying to grab Richard's sleeve, looking for the protection she had always relied on. Richard stepped away from her. He pulled his arm out of her reach. He looked at the woman he had been married to for over 30 years with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He realized that defending her meant chaining himself to a sinking ship. He chose self-preservation. Susan collapsed into the chair. The officers instructed her to stand and place her hands behind her back. When she could not muster the physical strength to comply, they gently but firmly pulled her to her feet. The metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting closed echoed in the quiet room. It was a sharp, clinical sound. It sounded exactly like consequence. On the opposite side of the table, Trevor did not fare any better. He attempted to argue, spouting disjointed financial jargon about margin calls and temporary liquidity deficits. The officers ignored the monologue. They spun him around, forced his hands behind his back, and secured his wrists in steel cuffs. The tailored, expensive shirt he wore stretched awkwardly across his shoulders. The illusion of the wealthy day trader shattered forever. Haley sat frozen in her chair, watching the officers detain her husband. She did not shed a single tear for him. She looked at Trevor with a cold, calculating emptiness. She realized the luxurious lifestyle she believed she had married into was a mirage. She was bound to a man facing a $90,000 default judgment and a multi-year federal prison sentence. The marriage was over before the ink on the catering contract had even dried. Russo directed the officers to escort the suspects out of the residence. They marched Susan and Trevor through the foyer. My mother refused to look at me as she passed. She kept her chin tucked against her chest, her eyes fixed firmly on the hardwood floor. Trevor glared at me, a silent, impotent rage burning in his expression, but he lacked the courage to speak. I watched them walk out the front door and down the concrete path toward the waiting patrol cruisers. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated their figures, casting long, erratic shadows across the manicured suburban lawns. I stepped back into the archway of the dining room. The space was a portrait of total devastation. Patricia sat slumped in her chair, holding her head in her hands, mourning the loss of the $10,000 she would never recover. Haley stared blankly at the wall, mentally calculating the quickest route to an annulment. Richard stood near the head of the oak table, looking at the broken pieces of the cheap plastic pen resting on top of the liability waiver. His financial ruin was absolute. The corporate lawyers from Sterling & Associates were drafting the mechanic's lien against his property. To satisfy the $23,000 catering debt, the accrued legal penalties, and the upcoming criminal defense attorney retainers, he would have no choice but to liquidate his remaining assets. Because the second mortgage had consumed the equity, the forced sale of the four-bedroom colonial would yield nothing but an eviction notice. He would be left penniless, navigating the final chapters of his life in a rented apartment, carrying the shame of a shattered legacy. They had attempted to steal my future to preserve their comfort. In doing so, they had triggered their own annihilation. I did not offer a parting speech. I did not demand an apology. There was nothing left to extract from this room. The audit was closed. The ledger was balanced. I reached for the buttons of my tailored charcoal coat. I secured them one by one, methodical and precise. I adjusted the lapels, picked up my leather briefcase, and turned away from the wreckage. I walked out the front door. The cool night air hit my face, carrying the scent of cut grass and distant rain. The police cruisers were already pulling away from the curb, transporting the architects of the fraud to the municipal booking center. I unlocked my sedan, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I pulled away from Patricia's house, navigating the quiet neighborhood streets until I merged onto the interstate highway, heading back to Maryland. I drove in total silence. I left the radio off. I watched the lane dividers slip past the headlights in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. For the first 30 minutes of the drive, a profound sense of loss hovered in the periphery of my mind. I had just orchestrated the arrest of my own mother. I had dismantled my sister's marriage. I had condemned my father to financial destitution. I was officially an orphan, severed from the bloodline that had produced me. But as the miles rolled away, the heavy burden of grief began to lift, replaced by a strange, undeniable clarity. I thought back to the humid July evening 2 weeks prior. I pictured myself standing in the foyer of the Wilmington Country Club. I remembered the scent of the imported orchids. I recalled the heavy oak doors shutting in my face. I remembered my mother handing me a folded index card with a Zoom link. And I remembered the silver foil VIP wristbands. At the time, the wristbands symbolized rejection. It was a visual marker of my exclusion from the family unit. It communicated that I was not worthy of a seat at the table. I was just an ATM, a silent benefactor expected to fund the party from the shadows. Now, driving through the darkness, the true meaning of that wristband crystallized. By locking me out of that ballroom, they had inadvertently protected me from the blast radius. If they had welcomed me inside, if they had treated me with an ounce of genuine affection, I might have lowered my defenses. I might have ignored the forged contract to keep the peace. I might have authorized the venue payment to save them from embarrassment. But they chose to exclude me. They chose to show me exactly how little my presence mattered. That exclusion was not a punishment, it was an immunization. The empty silver wristband was the greatest gift my family ever gave me. It stripped away the illusion of loyalty. It cured me of the obligation to save them. It provided the exact measure of emotional distance required to conduct a forensic audit on my own flesh and blood without shedding a single tear. They told me I was not family. I simply proved them right. I crossed the state line into Maryland. The tension in my shoulders dissolved entirely. The anxiety that had plagued me for 32 years, the constant, exhausting effort to earn a place in a family that viewed my independence as an insult, evaporated into the night air. I was alone in the car. I was alone in the world. And for the first time in my life, I experienced a state of unshakable, perfect peace. If you have ever been the bank for a family that did not love you, drop a comment. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Every family maintains an invisible ledger. Long before the first bank account is opened or the first mortgage is signed, parents and children begin to record the subtle debts and credits of their shared existence. We do not just pass down eye-color heirlooms or the antique china. We pass down expectations. We assign roles. And in the quiet architecture of the American home, those roles often become the rigid blueprints that dictate how a child will build their entire life. When we look back at the wreckage of Cleo Bell's family, it is easy to focus on the spectacular nature of the collapse. It is easy to point to the felony wire fraud, the forged DocuSign contract, or the flashing lights of the police cruisers in the suburban driveway. But the true tragedy of this story did not begin with a stolen Social Security number. It began decades earlier in the quiet, everyday moments of parenting, where the foundational values of honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness were slowly, methodically abandoned. In traditional American culture, we place a massive premium on the concept of independence. We admire the self-starter, the resilient worker, the individual who can pull themselves up without asking for a hand. Cleo embodied this ideal. She was disciplined, focused, and profoundly capable. But within the walls of a dysfunctional family, a child's independence is rarely celebrated for what it is. Instead, it is frequently misinterpreted as a lack of need. This is the silent penalty of the strong child. Parents like Susan and Richard look at a daughter who pays her own way, manages her own emotions, and navigates her own struggles, and they make a catastrophic miscalculation. They assume that because she does not demand their protection, she does not require their love. They view her competence not as a virtue to be nurtured, but as an endless resource to be mined. They stop seeing a daughter and start seeing a utility. This lack of emotional awareness is a profound failure of family responsibility. Parenting does not cease simply because a child learns how to survive on their own. In fact, that is often when a child needs a different, deeper kind of guidance, the assurance that their value is not tethered solely to their utility. By treating Cleo as a human checking account, her parents taught her that transactional compliance was the only currency they accepted. They handed her an empty silver wristband and told her to stand outside the velvet rope. They thought they were merely prioritizing the aesthetic of the wedding. In reality, they were drafting the blueprint for their own isolation. On the other side of that ledger is the curse of the golden child. If Cleo is a cautionary tale about the dangers of transactional love, Haley is a devastating portrait of the perils of parental enabling. There is a pervasive, dangerous myth in modern parenting that our primary job is to shield our children from discomfort. Susan could not bear to see Haley upset over a $4,000 wedding dress she could not afford. She could not bear to deny her daughter the country club reception or the illusion of the wealthy, successful groom. In her desperate attempt to provide the perfect life, Susan removed every natural consequence from Haley's path. But true family responsibility is not about removing obstacles. It is about teaching a child how to navigate them with integrity. When parents refuse to let their children hear the word no, they do not create successful adults. They create fragile, entitled dependents who are entirely unequipped for the brutal realities of the world. Haley was kept ignorant of the financial mechanics of her own life. She was allowed to believe that a luxury high-rise and a designer wardrobe simply manifested out of thin air. Because her parents never taught her the value of honesty and hard work, she became the perfect oblivious mark for a con artist like Trevor. Susan thought she was protecting her daughter's happiness. Instead, she was leading her blindfolded to the edge of a cliff. At the center of this domestic tragedy is the total erosion of honesty. A traditional family structure relies on a bedrock of trust. It requires parents to be the moral compass, demonstrating through their actions that the truth is always more valuable than the facade. But Susan and Richard fell victim to the most toxic aspect of modern suburban life, the desperate need to maintain appearances. They took out a second mortgage to fund an illusion. They fabricated a heart condition to exploit their oldest daughter's empathy. They forged federal documents to pay for a party. They traded their integrity for the appearance of success, proving that when the aesthetic becomes more important than the foundation, the house will inevitably collapse. A family cannot survive when the parents are the architects of the deceit. You cannot rob Peter to pay Paul and call it love. You cannot forge signatures and call it sacrifice. The story of the Bell family is a harsh mirror held up to the way we raise our children. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the ledgers we keep in our own homes. Are we celebrating our children for who they are or for what they provide? Are we preparing them for the rigors of reality, or are we subsidizing their illusions until the bill comes due? True parental guidance requires the courage to be fair. It requires the emotional intelligence to recognize that the quiet child needs as much validation as the demanding one. It requires the moral fortitude to tell the truth, even when the truth means downsizing the house, canceling the country club, or admitting that the money is simply gone. If the dynamics of this story resonate with you, if you have ever found yourself standing on the outside of a velvet rope while the people you bled for danced on the inside, you are not alone. There is a whole community of us learning how to break those plastic pens and walk away. Drop a comment below and share your own experiences with family ledgers and misplaced loyalty. And please hit subscribe and follow the channel Luke Vengeance. We will keep untangling these stories one undeniable truth at a time. As for Cleo, she drove away from that flashing suburban street into the quiet Maryland night, unburdened and free. But the rest of us are left to wonder about the tables we sit at. We are left to look at the people passing the plates, pouring the wine, and giving the toasts. We are left to wonder if the bonds that tie us together are forged in genuine love, or if they are just another contract waiting to be audited. Sometimes the most terrifying thing about the dark isn't the monsters hiding in the shadows. It's the realization of who built the house.